Sure. So I'm Logan Fieth, and I'm 29 years old, and I live in Seattle. And I've been making games as far as I can remember, basically, because I kind of found my way into it by realizing that I was spending more time in the level editors of games than the actual games themselves.
Yeah.
But I started with stuff that was not like Little Big Planet. I eventually got to Little Big Planet, but I was doing making Far Cry maps, and me and my friends would play them and stuff like that. Just in the in-game editors. Just went further and further into in-game editor or in-engine editors.
Yeah.
Went to Little Big Planet and then Source Engine, and then went to college for game design, and I've been indie ever since I graduated.
Cool. So I'm trying to figure out, I don't know, because I can't even remember when we first started emailing, and I'm sure it has something to do with the games you make, and I had some sort of weird question, I'm sure, for you, or was curious to hear your thoughts. I'm trying to remember how exactly we got on each other's radar, which I guess doesn't really matter for this conversation, but I guess, you said, you've been indie ever since, but I guess I would just be curious to hear you talk a little bit about, the kind of games you like to make, or, the sort of things you like to explore when you're making games, because I could put it in my own words, but since you're here, I'd rather hear you put it in your own words.
Yeah. I think the way most people describe the games I work on is, mind-bending or weird or trippy. I like working on, usually I work on puzzle games, and I like working on, for me, the drive is I want to explore a system or a mechanic itself. And what gets me interested in a project is I think about it, the mechanic itself, and can't fully form what it'll play out as in my head. And so I have to make the game to find out actually how it would work once you bring in all these different variables. And I think I find it interesting because I know as a player I like exploring, and so I feel like those are kind of the same, a similar thing of I like exploring the content of a game when I play it, but also I like exploring where a mechanic will take me when I'm making a game.
Yeah. So I guess there's no real easy way to dive into this from talking about the type of games you make, but at least it gives a little bit of color to where we're entering this sort of topic, which is, we had been talking a little bit about blame as it sort of intersects with thinking about the games ecosystem or games industry or games fandom or whatever kind of nebulous groups of people you want to talk about around games. I've been thinking about that in a number of different ways just from working on this book last year, and you sort of brought it up as a topic as far as I'm just going to read back from your email. You said that there seems to be this tendency for people to look for who to blame when a game doesn't turn out stellar. So I do want to get more into blame, but I want to talk a little bit more about this whole not turning out stellar thing. What does that tend to mean? I guess I was just wondering, does that just mean do people define a game as disappointing because it didn't turn out as advertised, or what's your sense of it? When people are upset that a game didn't turn out, as good as they thought it should be.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's kind of nebulous. Because I think it's basically whatever the online narrative is. That's kind of what people think of the game, a game as. Trying to think of different examples. Just as an example, Mass Effect Andromeda. I'm sure there are people who enjoyed that game, but it's widely panned as it went horribly wrong. And I don't know. I've never touched the game, so I don't know. But it's interesting how it's. Or as another example, I don't want to get too much into No Man's Sky, but as another example, like recently there was a video put out where someone like put together clips of like how No Man's Sky turned around and like got itself better and redeemed itself, or the developers did. But that narrative only stuck once that YouTube video came out, and it's interesting how like that a YouTube video will control the narrative that way, whereas I feel like No Man's Sky got a lot better, more and more over the past few updates. But it didn't have that narrative that it actually got better until that YouTube video came out, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to zoom out as much as possible on those patterns because I think it's really sort of, for me, I feel like it's kind of weird and maybe unhealthy in some ways that, like, I also haven't played those games, and yet I know the narratives around them, and I know what the shorthand is. Like, if you mention, just Mass Effect 3, probably we're going to talk about the ending, but I still have never even started Mass Effect 1. But I know, maybe it's through a quirk of, like, the same weird thing that drove me to start having these conversations, but, like, is it... I struggle with, like, how big are these narratives truly? Like, are they just, like, things that bleed out of Twitter into media? Is it just YouTube? Like, because you can get the sense that, like, this game's ecosystem, like, oh, everyone must be talking about it, right? But, like, no one else I know has probably heard of these terms, No Man's Sky, what's that? Mass Effect, what's that? And I really just feel like it comes back to, like, there's some sort of disappointment about, like, it didn't shake out the way it was advertised or hyped up to be. And maybe people are upset because they felt like they helped shape the narrative of, like, what it was supposed to be. And then they feel, like, violated in some way because it turns out they didn't really shape it at all because the game is just what the game was. I don't know. I mean, obviously, maybe not obviously, but it probably sounds like I've been thinking about this stuff a long, long time, but I mean, do you talk about this with, like, other people who make games about, like, how to control these narratives or what to do to get out in front of them or how to mitigate or handle, like, when it blows up in your face?
Not too much. I think the hard part for me is that it feels like it's not something that you can control.
Yeah.
I like you can't sell a game this way, but I think it would be best for everyone if, like, the players and the developers, if we just didn't say anything and then a game comes out on release day and then people buy it. But of course, that's not a way to sell a game. You'll never sell any copies. But in my mind, that's like the ideal scenario. Just because development is so tumultuous and, like, I feel like hype is. It feels like it always needs to be like, this is going to be the best game ever. Like, every game that gets hyped up is hyped up as that.
Right.
And maybe there's a little bit less of that now with, like, some pretty big, like, high profile titles kind of not landing it. But yeah, I don't know.
Why do customers think they have all the answers?
It's a good question.
Not to reduce them to just customers, because I don't like reinforcing that as, like, oh, we're just consumers, but that does, I don't know, in some ways that does seem to be like people who engage in that sort of thing, like they want to be thought of in that way, but I mean, they're not the one making the game, so...
Yeah. I think it's, there's a lot of aspects to that, but I think the hard part is that, one is that I think valuable feedback is, like, how you feel about something, but, like, if you just say how you think you should fix it, like, that's not really valuable as a developer. Mm-hmm. But then I think another aspect is that players don't think about, and I think some players don't want to think about it, is that game development is a ton of trade-offs, and as developers, we have to leave some players out. Like we have to make decisions where we're like, well, we can do this or this. We have to choose if we want these players or these players, and we're going to go with one of them, right? And those are hard decisions. Like, it's not like it's easy decisions for us as developers. But I think that's something that players don't want to think about, is like, we can't please everybody, right?
Yeah. I mean, you were saying that you almost wish that, like, games would just come out and there wasn't this runway of, you know, building buy-in, building up expectations. I'm not asking you at all to, like, name names or even specific companies or anything, but I guess I'm just curious to hear you talk about, like, when it comes to this, like, looking for who to blame thing when a game doesn't turn out so stellar. How do media outlets sort of make that dynamic worse, or how do they reinforce it?
I don't know if they do too much. I don't know if I've seen too much that has too many outlets that have done that. I see a lot of it just like independent people on YouTube and that sort of stuff.
Are these like influential people on YouTube or aspiring influential people? Like people who are already established and sort of move the needle, or people who are trying to come up and move the needle themselves?
I'm not sure. It seems like it's usually just like a random video, that happens to go viral. You know, like the one I mentioned earlier about No Man's Sky, the video about No Man's Sky turning around. Like, I don't even know who made that video. I don't know if he's super popular or if it was just that one video that went popular. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, I don't know. I'm sort of not a good data point on this because I know some of the people who worked on that particular game, but I was aware that, like, there was that huge Reddit thread of, like, here's all the things that were promised, and here's all the ways they fucked it up, and here's all the easy fixes they could do. Maybe it is no single thing. I mean, I think of Reddit maybe more than YouTube, but I can't sit through like 30-minute YouTube videos and about dressing down like, oh, here's all the ways Logan fucked it up again or whatever.
Yeah.
Which I'm just making up an example. I don't know if you've had that finger pointed at you.
No, fortunately, I have not.
Well, good. That's something to aspire to, maybe. They want to take you down, but I don't know. Like I think about that in connection with, like, you mentioned spending a lot of time with in-game, level editors, and like I look at something like Mario Maker. That series is sort of really taking off, and obviously it's not a new thing, but part of me almost feels like that's kind of the future of games that, like, a lot of people want, where it's like, here, instead of nitpicking it, you make the game.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe that's a cynical thought. I don't know. I've heard it from others that I've interviewed, but it's interesting to think about. I'm sure people even also nitpick that about all the stuff that they didn't think to include or the ways they messed it up. Maybe it's just people who are into games are just hard to please. Maybe that's sort of... maybe that's the bigger umbrella topic we're not naming, but... Then I struggle, like, well, are they harder to please than, like, fans of movies or music? Like, is it really that distinct, I don't think it's that distinct of a group, just people who like games.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
That's okay. So, something else that you brought up, so we were talking about blame, that's one thing. Another word you brought up is content. And so... Yeah, I mean, you said that it's art without a spine, and content is to be consumed, art is to be preserved. So can you talk a little bit about, like, how you started noticing this in games and sort of when it started to really bother you?
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, I think it's just been over the past few years with games as a service. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also outside of games as well, as, like, YouTubers have gotten popular. Like, even not even like just YouTubers that play games, but YouTubers of any kind, like they always call themselves content creators, or they're always referred to as content creators or influencers, but they're never called artists, or almost never, you know. And they never say they're making art, but if they're influencers, like that's I don't know. It's this weird like double thing where like if you call yourself an influencer, obviously that you want to influence people and culture, but at the same time, a lot of the time, since you're not calling yourself an artist or calling the stuff you make art, you don't have to take responsibility for what you're making. So you get like, you want the good things about art, like the recognition and the prestige and the respect, but you don't want any of the responsibility of how you actually impact the world, like the downsides of it.
My feelings, like, it's almost like, I wonder if like people who, there's like a weird connection there where I feel like people who are artists may sort of balk at like describing themselves as artists, but I don't think they would call themselves content providers. Whereas people who want to be influencers, I don't think they necessarily are thinking about how to influence culture as much as like they just want money.
Sure, that's true, yeah.
So I wonder if there's like better terms for these things. Content provider doesn't seem like there's not enough disdain in that term because people proudly wear it. But I wonder, like, does it impact the way that like do you see people who make video games? Like, do they think about their work in that way where it's almost like I remember like Tom York talking about it on some podcast, like the first time he came across that term. I think it was like from a cell phone company or something where like they contacted him and was like, does radio have any content that we can use for ringtones? And he sort of took it to mean like stuffing for a hotel pillow or something. Like it doesn't even really matter what it is. It's just sort of crap to cram into somewhere.
Okay.
I mean, I've seen it just change so much, just, my entire field in media where it has sort of taken over, like the term blogger you don't really hear anymore, but like I know people who write in media who sort of proudly say they're content providers, but I don't know if this sort of thinking has impacted the way that like video games are thought of or even made. Have you come across that?
Yeah, I don't know too many people working on live games, and I think that's primarily where the term is used. But I don't know. I feel like I don't hear too many people talking about that they're making new content. They're also not referring to like their project as art all the time. Yeah. But I feel like especially in the indie world, like I feel like we're more prone to think of the project we're working on as something that has artistic merit, and not like a new piece of content, you know.
Right.
At least that's the way I like to think about it. Because there's like this weird, like consuming content just sounds like you're eating, like you're eating lunch and it's not a nice lunch. It's like you're just eating it because you're hungry. Like you're hungry and that's about it, you know?
Yeah, it's like the old Jetsons vitamin pill or meal pill or something. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I guess it's in line with like just like this sense of with like being online so much. This sense of like everything about living now is accelerated, and so like we have less time to sort of spend and savor with each individual thing. You know, like it's such a commonplace thing to just sort of like watch TV and also be on your phone or also be on your laptop. Like you can't devote any time to any one thing. So it's like we're blurring the lines of like what each of these distinct things are, you know, like it's all, so I mean, I don't know. It's weird because I remember I used to really take issue with that term and it still bugs me, content. Mm-hmm. I haven't thought about it in a long time. So I don't know. I wonder if like in some way this ties in with like like the way of like blame that we were talking about in games before, of like just sort of reducing games down to content. Does it somehow make it easier to blame them for things, or to hold the people behind them like accountable in some way for wronging them in some way? I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this. I mean, this probably ties into what you mentioned of like life is so accelerated. There's so much content to see, to put it one way.
Yeah, you gotta really,
but like I
gotta really learn to stop and smell the content.
Yeah, exactly. Before you consume it. But I think there is something there about there's not room for an opinion or something to have a nuanced opinion on something like a game. I think it's just much cleaner for it to be like, oh, Mass Effect Andromeda, it was a huge failure, and then go on with your life. Like, you don't need to think about it too much. And it's EA's fault or whoever, like it's the truth is probably much more nuanced, where it was like maybe there was a lot of miscommunication within the team, and maybe EA kind of messed it up, but not really, but like, that's not an easy, succinct thing that you can like tweet or put into a YouTube video or something like that, So maybe there's something there about like having a clear narrative, just fits with how we communicate nowadays.
So, I mean, I get the sense that like, we even sort of distill that down with things like sequelitis, like I mentioned the other 3 Mass Effect games, and I guess we're talking about a sort of reimagined other series. I have not really played any of them, so I don't really know too much. So I think it's easy to sort of gloss over what it is people like you do make and think that like, oh, everything's been done, which I don't think. I mean, I think that you're sort of setting out to really push in the other direction with what you do. So it's not so much the case, but I feel like okay, so if we're glossing over nuance and we're saying, whatever, Andromeda is just a mess. Like, what nuance are we missing, or what nuances are like helpful for people who make games to learn from others? Attempts that maybe don't always stick their landing. Like I feel like that's true in movies. Like if you want to learn a lot about like how to make movies, you get something from everything. Even if you watch quote unquote bad movies, you still learn you learn things to integrate into what you try to do next, or even how to just appreciate movies, a little more deeply. But I don't know that I've really heard people talk about that in games, like what they sort of learn from things that they feel aren't so successful. I'm certainly familiar with like, GDC or like Gama Sutra or whatever, like sort of post-mortems. But those to me always feel like they seem to suggest there's some sort of checklist of like, do X and Y and talk about Z on social media platform A or B, and you'll be fine. But I don't really think it's that. I don't really think it's that much of an assembly line as the way it's discussed. But I also don't make games, so I guess the question is like, what nuances would developers like benefit from if deeper things were discussed more? I really don't want to harp on Mass Effect, but it is a helpful example. And it might be good to talk about games we actually know something about.
Yeah. I don't know. That's a good question. I think it is interesting that like there's not really the closest thing to like a public place that game developers talk about development and stuff like that is GDC or Gama Sutra. But yeah, I feel like anything on Twitter, like people are mainly trying to hype up their game or sell their game, which is fine, but like they're not going. You can't really go in depth about a nuanced project and how it might have failed or succeeded. I don't know. I think for me, it's much more interesting to just play a game and try to see what you can learn from it on its own merits, rather than, like I mentioned before, like trying to find the blame for who might have, made this thing that you don't like or whatever.
I mean, I think for people who cover games, like how they're made in general, is honestly like a bit of magic, a bit of mystery, and a bit of black magic. So I don't know. I always just find it interesting to hear just the thinking and intent that goes into these sorts of things. So like, can you think of an example in like something you made that was like a lesson you picked up from something else you played before?
I'll have to think about examples for a bit, but I would say like most of what I make is just informed by, oh, this is interesting. I don't like that they did this. I'm going to make something that like addresses that. But yeah, let me think for a second.
I mean, it may even be just like general philosophy or like a way of thinking about a thing. I don't think it's really like it may even be hard to recognize in the rear view or even at the time that's sort of a thing that you sort of, dented in some way or shaped in some way your approach.
Mm-hmm. I think the button prompts thing that I mentioned to you in email, I think that's definitely one thing of games. Even Nintendo is guilty of it with Mario Odyssey, like going way overboard on button prompts and like with text of like telling you exactly what it's going to do. I think the biggest offender I've seen is in one of the Assassin's Creed games, where every time you get into a cave, it shows you the prompt of how to turn on or get out your torch, like every single time. It's just like, what's the point of this? Why not just make it automatic?
Yeah.
But I think that has informed. Like if you look at older games, like I've been trying to figure out where we started doing that as developers of just throwing button prompts all over the screen. Because like if you look at older games, they didn't have that. I mean, they also usually didn't have button prompts at all, even to teach you initially, because they had like instruction manuals.
And there were fewer buttons too, I suppose.
Yeah,
if we're talking about console. Yeah.
But for me, as a player, I know that I want to hit as soon as I start a new game, I want to hit every button and see what it does. And so as a developer, I want to attract those same players. So I try to keep button prompts as minimal as possible and try to treat the player as a player and not just like a mindless viewer, essentially.
Well, I mean, you said that like to treat players as adults. I mean, I think you sort of tracked this back in our emails to objective arrows in BioShock. Mm-hmm. I mean, mm-hmm. I know from friends who've worked on or written on these sort of big games or open world games that honestly the way it's discussed is they assume that players don't pay attention to anything. They forget things often. But I mean, there is also too that, they don't know when people may like stop for like 3-4 months and then pick the game back up and be confused.
That is a good point.
On the other hand, it takes you out of it when like, even just sort of like in the story, like you just talk to a character or whatever, and a piece of information is shared, and then like 3 or 4 lines later, they're like reacting to the same information as if it's new. I mean, these are small things that sort of do break the world, which I guess doesn't really matter. I think for me, and also for you, the bigger issue is just treating us like we're idiots. Like they don't sort of trust us to. It's just weird that they would spend that much money creating something that big and then have so little faith in the people that it's intended for. Yeah,
exactly. Well, it's interesting you mentioned like the breaking the immersion, because I think that's actually like one of the main reasons I play games is to be immersed and to feel like I'm actually in a different world. And 2 things that I can think of that break my immersion are things like button prompts and things that are like reminding me how to play, and also as a side thing, like anything to do with microtransactions or free to play, because then I'm thinking about real world money, and that takes me out of it.
I've just found like usually I don't know, because I guess I still play games quote unquote the old way, where like I'll check the options or the different things you can sort of customize before you go in. And I've really come to appreciate the fact that there's like an accessibility option where instead of those constant button presses, you can just hold a button down.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've come across that, but it does make me think like, well, why is this such a thing? I mean, I never played BioShock either. I mean, is that just another example of the same thing? I guess the button presses are different. I guess it just feels like lazy design. I guess that's sort of what we're sort of not labeling as such, but is it?
Well, I think I think it kind of ties in with the like constant stream of content. Like you don't. I think like a lot of players or developers don't want to risk losing a player with something that's potentially boring or frustrating for a few minutes to a few hours or whatever. Like for example, like Dark Souls, the map in Dark Souls is like pretty complex and interweaving, and there's no objective markers or anything like that. But so a player could get lost pretty easily or frustrated by going to a high level area too soon. But it's also really, once you take the time to learn the map, it's also really satisfying. So I think I think it happens a lot just because developers are worried about potentially losing a player because they're not, constantly on the right track, or they might get frustrated or bored for a little bit.
Well, I suppose too, yeah. I mean, but there's also the other thing where isn't there a risk of alienating, I don't want to say more sophisticated players, but don't they alienate a certain type of player? I don't want to think about it. I don't want to talk about it that way of like, well, by dumbing things down too much. But maybe I'm just being too nice. Isn't that what we're talking about? Although I think probably, even though we've talked about, well, I don't know, I can only speak for myself. Even though we've talked about like BioShock or Mass Effect. I mean, it sounds like you and we still play these types of games, right? But yeah, I don't know how grudgingly you do it. I maybe we both can do the same thing, sort of write it off as like, well, it's research, Yeah.
I mean, for me, I wonder how many people it actually turns off enough that they don't play the game. Because like for me, I love BioShock, and like Dead Space has a similar thing of like you press a button and it tells you where to go at any time. But I love Dead Space except for that specific thing. And yeah, I don't know. It must not. I think in a lot of cases it must not be something that turns off a lot of players, or maybe it does, and I'm just not one of those players.
Well, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, if you're really into this stuff, you do start to notice how sort of choice, or at least the illusion of choice, the types of experiences you can have are kind of being sanded down. I mean, I used to sort of track it by, like, types of characters. Like, I remember the first time I saw, like, a pregnant woman in a video game, like, I started to realize, like, I just realized, like, I've never seen this before in a video game, and I feel like you start to notice those things, and then you notice those types of things more often in games. But I just feel like there are so many small, like, quote-unquote innovations in games that, like, you can't help but wonder, like, all right, well, where could these dominoes tip to? How could games be different if there was a little bit more trust or a little bit more just recognition of, like, these are potential points of friction where you could trust more. But I don't know. I mean, because I feel like the kind of games you make are really interesting and unusual. And yet it always sort of struck me as a little odd or even unfair where like big budget spaces, their attitude is like, well, it's up to the people with with the least amount of money to take the biggest creative risks. I think that sort of minimizes the types of risks that like, sure, they're taking a type of risk, but I mean, is that sort of your feeling that like the expectation is like, well, if you're on your own or you're a really small team or you don't have big backing, like you should just do really different stuff? Is that the feeling, the expectation of for indies, I guess, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think you need to, you have to stand out and take a risk as an indie, or else otherwise because otherwise people can go and play the way more polished version, right?
So, but what's the wisdom like when you bump into like game publishers or whatever about like, how do you, or even from colleagues or peers, like how do you balance that kind of risk with that kind of boldness, I guess?
I think it's, I don't know. I think it's the classic marketing thing of like something people want what they've seen before, but a little different. And I think if you can ground it in a genre that people know, then I think that helps. Although personally, as a player, I love when a game defies genre, but I know that's not for a lot of people. Something like Braid was just like a huge success, and I think partially because people are like, oh, it's like Mario, but instead you're solving puzzles. You know, like that's an easy. I think the elevator pitch helps, like a short elevator pitch that you can understand, and also like when you look at it, you're like, oh, I know what that is. It's a first person game, or it's a platformer. But I mean, I think it helps if it's a widely known genre. Like I feel like it doesn't help if it's like, oh, it's a MOBA, but I guess MOBAs are well known, but like not as well known as like Mario, you know?
Right. Well, and obviously too, you get to, Jonathan Blow is an interesting example, and I think obviously you get really successful taking a risk, and then people trust you to take bigger risks, but obviously not everyone is in that situation. But I mean, I just don't know much about, I figure like, so like for the stuff that you make, to bring it back to you, like, how far along do you have to get in like making a game where you realize sort of like, oh, okay, here's the thing that makes it different? Because I know you said you sort of tinker on like, I don't know, it sounded like you're a little bit like me, where you just need to expose yourself to certain things that you disagree with until you finally react, or you just want to explore like a contrary point of view. But I don't know how far along you have to get in the process. Like, are we talking like months and months or years into a project before you start doing that sort of contrarian tinkering? Or in the way you work, are you able to do that out of the gate? Where you sort of figure out like, okay,
it's a little bit weird because
here's what the quote unquote twist is or whatever.
Usually it's the like figuring out what the twist is. I feel like is the way I like to start. Just because I don't know, that's just like, that gets my mind thinking about like, oh, okay, I haven't seen this type of twist before. Let's get in and actually like prototype it and see what it does.
So what sort of things like that are you thinking about now? Because I know you said you've been thinking a lot about multiplayer versus single player divide. And I was curious to hear why that's been on your mind lately, but I don't know if that's tied in with like what you're hoping to work on someday.
So I think, so my most recent project I worked on was Superliminal, and we shipped it in November. But throughout the development, I think one of the hardest things to figure out was the story. And so I think that's kind of what prompted it, of like, I kept coming back to, well, I feel like we need a story, and not just because of market demands. Like, I think the game feels different and better when you have a story. But I kept coming back to, like, but games historically, before video games, didn't really have stories. It was like separated, you know, between games might have a little bit of story, but barely any. And then story time, like, was around the campfire or whatever. And those were like two separate things. And so to me, like, it's still weird to me that, like, single player games even exist, even though I like single player games. You know, it's just something I've been trying to figure out.
But you mean it more from coming from a different place rather than like, well, multiplayer online is the dominant popular form. Like, you're coming from a different place than that, right?
Yeah, and I think actually, like, local multiplayer is one of my favorite types of games, but it's not super viable in our market. But I think that's just because of how we've set things up. Like, I don't think it's naturally that way.
Yeah.
And for me, like, a lot of the times, online multiplayer doesn't scratch that same itch as local multiplayer, you know?
Well, yeah, and I don't think you're alone in that, but because I'm there too, but unfortunately, because we're not participating there, like, our voices aren't really heard, because we're just sort of like, instead of a 1, we're a 0, so we're sort of a signal not going out because we don't participate there. But I mean, I think it's interesting because I think you and I are talking about, or you talked about in our emails before, like, I'm interested very much in, like, well, where is it that games seem to be losing people, or like, where is it that they don't connect with games, and why, or where is it that they've sort of lost that connection with games? And I know that you mentioned single player games. I don't know. I think you just said something like, a lot of people would just be like, well, why don't I just read a book instead? But I mean, what's your sense of sort of like, why is it that most people, or when people don't connect with games, why does single player sort of seem like a turnoff or not that interesting?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess for me, it's like, I go to multiplayer to get into the mechanics with friends, if it's like local multiplayer, you know, whereas single player, I play to lose myself in a world and get immersed. And I think that might be I don't know how you explain that to someone or pitch that to someone, of like, play this game to be immersed in this. Like, that's not as strong of a selling point as, like, play with your friends, or like read this book about topic X, you know?
Well, I think too, like, there's also been this emergence of, like, people who, like, they just play Destiny. It makes it easier to sort of pick a lane rather than, like, having to get reinvested in some other new series or some other new world or some other new developer or whatever that they've never heard of before. Whereas I think something like Fortnite, people may not know what it is, but they know what it is. If you know what I mean. But I mean, I've thought about this a lot, and I feel like other people I know who are really into games sort of don't know what I mean when I talk about playing single player games, which is my preference, and I sort of talk about their stories. And like, I have this feeling, I mean, you said that, like, single player games with stories don't actually make much sense. And I used to say that, like, I feel like single player games don't really tell stories. They sort of explore a premise. And, like, I was jotting down notes from when we were going to talk, and, like, a recent one that comes to mind, semi-recent, is, like, Fallout 4. And so I don't know if you played it, but, like, it's a game where, like, you know, it's Fallout, which is a known quantity, but in this one you have to go off and rescue your kidnapped child. But of course, that's the last thing you do, because you have to go off and upgrade your base and upgrade your stats and do all, you know, it's like the last thing you will do is go and rescue your kid. And I don't think Fallout 4 is meant to be some sort of comment on parenthood and like their reluctant relationship with their offspring. So I don't know, like as a story, like it doesn't feel super cohesive, and I almost feel like that's not really the point of these games, and yet you use the word immersion, and I think I would go even like an even lower degree, where like I feel like I play games to sort of be distracted, and yet I still think that like there should be sort of more quote unquote sophisticated options. But I don't know, like I wonder what's missing in single player games to make them actually tell stories. I don't think they have to be quite like movies, but like what's your sense of like what's missing that would help them tell stories better, or to tell better stories?
I think for me it's realizing, I don't know, I could be wrong, but for me, I think when people say they liked a story in a game, they're actually saying that they liked being immersed in the world of that game.
Yeah.
And they just don't know how to put it into words. And I think focusing on that would be helpful for a lot of games, like realizing that the story can be there, but you have this fantasy that you're trying to sell, and focusing on that, immersing that player in that fantasy is the goal, whether it be the fantasy of being a jerk goose in Untitled Goose Game, or if the fantasy is in Fallout 4 of like the fantasy in Fallout 4 is probably actually like going and seeing these people in a wasteland and you know, going on quests for them and seeing what their little stories are, but like being immersed in that world of a nuclear apocalypse.
Yeah, it's weird in those huge games where you're sort of the center of the universe, and then simultaneously you're like a non-entity.
Yeah.
That's weird.
For sure.
I don't know. I mean, that's maybe you disagree. That's sort of my sense, because I feel like for a long time I had avoided, just because who has the time, right, to play those sort of big open world games, and yet increasingly I've been checking them out just because I feel like they've been sort of a blind spot for me, but they seem to all sort of, I don't want to say formula, but they do sort of fit that mold. So I don't know. I mean, I think you also said that like you just feel like single player games, they try to do too much. You said they try to tell a story and provide gameplay. And so for people who don't make games, like why are those two things in tension with each other?
I guess it's just something I've been thinking about. I don't know if they necessarily are in tension with each other, but it seems to me like if you look at anything previous to video games, not much has combined story and gameplay. Like chess technically has some quote unquote lore, but chess is mostly just gameplay. Sports, there's no story in sports, right? It's just like a soccer game. And sure, there's like the narrative of like which team is going to win and like who's going to the Super Bowl or whatever, but like there's no dressing, which like something I find interesting a lot to think about is like something like Dota has a lore and a story and a backdrop, but I think it might be more interesting if it was treated as a sport and it was just like gray box and didn't need all this fantasy stuff. And like I wonder if that would attract more people overall, or like a different audience, or if that would like not succeed, you know?
Well, I have just one more question here for you, unless is there something else you wanted to bring up that I didn't give you a chance to touch on?
No, not really.
Okay. Well, so this is a big one and a broad one, and one I ask everybody. What have video games accomplished?
That's a good question. What have they accomplished? I think they've certainly brought a lot of people together, whether it's communities in multiplayer games or just people talking about games. And I think, I don't know. And I think they've accomplished allowing players to get lost in their worlds.